Well, I'm delighted to be alongside Formula One and Formula E driver Karun Chandhok, who is, of course, known at the moment on being Channel 4 as commentator and pit lane reporter. Mr. Chandhok, welcome to the Pole Position podcast.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. Happy to join you guys.
Where should we start? You've certainly had a very exciting career. What got you into motor racing in the first place?
Well, my family were into it, and my grandfather used to race, my dad used to race, my grandmother did a bit of racing as well. So, I guess you could say in India, family business is a big thing, and this is ours. Nobody pushed me towards it. It was certainly something I chose to do. My brother, for example, has zero interest in racing, so. But at the end of the day, it was often a topic of conversation at the dinner table, and that's where my interest in the sport grew, really.
Obviously, you mentioned your family. Who was your biggest influence when growing up?
I'd say from a racing standpoint, certainly my dad. I grew up at a time where he was still actively driving. He was doing a lot of rallying at that time, so I used to travel all around India to follow the rallies with him. I used to obviously go to the circuit with him all the time, and he got me into the sport, and used to take me to the track, taught me how to drive when I was 9 years old. They got me my first go-kart when I was 6. So I think from a professional standpoint, certainly my dad. In terms of, let's say, as a personality, I'd say my mum's a fairly strong character as well. So there's a balance there.
Obviously, F1 is one of the most difficult things to get into. Only 20 odd drivers are able to represent 10 or 11 or 12 teams. When you joined F1 in 2010, how did you feel being one of only 20 to 24 drivers in the world to participate in Formula One?
In some way, it was a relief because you fulfilled a dream, you fulfilled a life ambition, and it's something that you've spent a long time and a lot of hours working on the way there. So, in some sense, there is a sense of relief that you've achieved that. But in another sense, it's obviously a great deal of excitement because you're all of a sudden on the grid and competing in a category that you only dreamt of doing one day. And when you were growing up, it was so far away. I used to grow up watching people like Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna and people like that, and racing in Formula One. And you never dreamed that one day you'd be on a Formula One grid.
Did it ever feel a bit weird when you were walking down the pit lane and there's Michael Schumacher, there's Fernando Alonso, Lewis Hamilton? Did you ever think, wow, I'm mixed in with these guys?
I think it wasn't weird, and in a sense, I wasn't in awe of them. I think that was important. I obviously had a huge amount of respect for people like the ones you just mentioned, and certainly I feel very privileged that I can say I raced on track at the same time as Michael Schumacher, because he was one of my heroes when I was growing up. And certainly in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I was just starting out, he was the man. And when I first went back when I first walked into the paddock in 2010, he was one of the first drivers to say, "Welcome to Formula One." And obviously it was his comeback that year. There was a lot of media attention around him and what would happen with his big comeback. But he was really, really, really nice to me, and just a nice person. And I feel very privileged for that.
Let's talk about your time in Formula E. Of course, that's a big upcoming motorsport. It's certainly attracted a lot of people to go and see it. Electric racing on the street circuits. Could you obviously it's an electric car, but would you be able to share with the fans what's the difference like for you as a driver driving one of those cars?
Well, I mean, in some ways, it's very similar to a any other car because you got two pedals, four wheels, and a steering wheel. But in other ways, obviously, you haven't got an engine, so it is different. The first thing that's quite apparent is you haven't got any sound, so you hear the wind more than anything else. It is a whole different way of going motor racing. But as I say, in some ways very different, in other ways very similar. It's certainly a series that the manufacturers are investing heavily in. There are a lot of pluses and minuses. On the plus side, I think racing on street circuits is a great challenge. I always enjoy going to street circuits. I think that's always a unique challenge in motorsport. We don't get to do enough of it, I think, in other categories. On the downside, obviously, the speeds are still significantly lower than other sort of single-seater categories. And we'll have to see how that development happens over the next few years. But as an engineering challenge, is certainly a big mental challenge. You spend a lot of time having to think of the strategy and managing your energy and things like that. So, a very challenging series.
But surely it's not a racing car without a noise.
Well, that's the purest view. And I think that's something that certainly, is constantly brought up and discussed, is the question of, can the purists really get behind it? Because I think we've learned from F1 when we went to the V6 hybrid engines that sound and noise is a very important part of the sport. Frankly, I don't actually think that the V6s sound that bad, but certainly there was a big school of thought and quite a few sort of vocal people who hated the sound of the cars. So, I think we've learned in this switch that sound is certainly very important from a motor racing standpoint for the fans.
Absolutely. Obviously, yourself and Narain Karthikeyan are the only Indian drivers to participate in Formula One, and obviously a few years ago we were able to have the Indian Grand Prix for a couple of years. I was just wondering, do you know what the current situation is with India and their involvement in motorsport?
There's obviously motor racing is happening on a domestic level. We haven't got the top level categories like Formula One, which is the obvious one, or WEC and things like that. I think it's quite a difficult scenario in India because there's a lot of fragmentation and politics involved in the sport there, and that ultimately hasn't helped in some ways. In other ways, if you look at the domestic racing that exists today, it's a big step up from what there was when Narain and I started. Certainly, there's a lot of national level racing and championships and things like that. So, but I think in order for the sport to come back up to its peak, which I think there was a peak around 2010-11. We had two drivers in F1. We had a team in F1. There was certainly a lot of interest in the sport, but the Grand Prix was a catalyst for it. And I think that's something that we need really to get it all back up and going again.
Is there any drivers out there that you would tell fans to look out for?
Well, I manage a young kid called Arjun Maini who's racing in GP3 at the moment. He won a race in Barcelona, and I've negotiated a deal for him to be a test driver with Haas at the moment. So he's in fact on his way to Maranello this weekend to do some sim work. So that's part of the deal that I sorted for him. So he's there. We've got a young kid called Jehan Tarwala in Formula 3 who's driving very well. So there are a couple of guys there. I think ultimately it's when you get to that F2 level that you can really judge whether one of these guys are going to make that step to F1, and also how far they're going to go. You every once in a generation you get a freak like Max Verstappen who is so outstanding that in his third year of car racing he ends up in Grand Prix racing. But that's a once in a generation talent. I think these boys, the next step for them is certainly to look at doing something in Formula 2, and then we see where we go from there.
Amazing. Obviously, I just thought I'd ask as well, because I'd imagine you'll be heading to the US Grand Prix in a week or so time.
Yeah.
What's it like then being in the media department now, watching the drivers go on and working for a channel like Channel 4?
I enjoy it. For certain audiences in the UK, I suppose they haven't seen me do a lot of TV stuff before, but Channel 4 is actually the fifth different broadcaster I've worked with in Formula 1, so I'm not new to this. I think I first did the Chinese Grand Prix in 2004, so it's been a little while. And as I said, worked with several different broadcasters, but I do enjoy it. The team we've got at Channel 4 are really good people, really, switched on. And also people I've known for a long time. When I was first testing with Red Bull, DC and Mark Webber were the two race drivers, and I've known Lee McKenzie, since at least a dozen years, and Ben Edwards I worked with when we did F1 in cinemas. We were commentating together, so I know a lot of the people involved in that team, it's been fun. I do enjoy it.
I must admit, when it was back to the BBC days of F1 with Jake Humphrey, I remember when he would always come and say hello to you and interview you, and even I think you guys did a package about the Indian Grand Prix as well. And I must admit, me and my mates loved it when you were on the TV. You were just great with your interviews for the BBC. Just thought I'd put that out there.
Thanks very much. Thank you.